There you go, CC. There you go, Caitlin. Way to hold it down, Caitlin Clark. Caitlin Clark told the WNBA, damn you and your bogus orange carpet. I ain't showing up to nothing. I'm not showing up to your bogus orange carpet. I'm not showing up to this joke of a three-point shootout. I'm not showing up to link up and kick it with none of y'all. Y'all fake, y'all phony, y'all jealous, y'all are haters. Caitlin Clark just pulled a no-show for opening day.
Picture this, a sold-out arena in Chicago. Thousands of fans who paid small fortunes for their seats. Television cameras positioned for what was being called the most watched moment in women's basketball history. Corporate sponsors with their logos plastered across every surface. A weekend that was supposed to redefine the WNBA forever. Then, hours before tip-off, one player made one decision and the whole thing detonated like a bomb in slow motion. No superstar, no crowd energy, no ratings, just panic. What you're about to hear is the full story of how the 2026 WNBA All-Star Weekend in Chicago went from the most anticipated celebration in the league's history to one of the most embarrassing organizational collapses in modern sports. And it all traces back to a secret meeting, a group of bitter veterans, and a young woman who decided she was done playing by rules designed to humiliate her. This isn't just a sports story. This is a power story, and the ending will genuinely surprise you. To understand how catastrophically this weekend fell apart, you first need to understand just how enormous the stakes were going in. The 2026 WNBA All-Star Weekend in Chicago wasn't just another mid-season exhibition. It had been built up over months as a genuine cultural moment, the kind of event that transcends the sport itself and bleeds into mainstream conversation. Ticket sales had been extraordinary. The arena sold out completely, and it didn't take long. Within days of availability, courtside passes were gone. Premium seats vanished. Even upper-level sections were snapped up faster than organizers had projected. By the time resale markets took over, standard tickets were trading at prices that would make NFL playoff fans wince. Some courtside packages reportedly hit the $5,000 mark. Not because people felt obligated to attend, because they genuinely, desperately wanted to be there. Television partners had invested aggressively. Broadcast deals were structured around projected viewership numbers that would have shattered every previous record for women's basketball in America. Advertisers had placed major bets on those projections. Brands that had never previously spent significant money on women's sports were suddenly writing big checks, specifically because of the audience this weekend was expected to deliver. And everyone in the industry knew exactly why those numbers were so high. It wasn't a mystery, it wasn't some complicated algorithm. It was one player, one name, one 22-year-old point guard from Indiana who had single-handedly restructured the commercial landscape of women's basketball in the span of roughly 2 years. Caitlin Clark had done something that decades of WNBA history, talented rosters, and well-meaning promotional campaigns had failed to do. She had made casual sports fans care. She had pulled in audiences who had never previously watched a women's basketball game in their lives. She had turned WNBA games into must-see events, and corporate America had followed the audience, as it always does, straight to her. The All-Star Weekend was supposed to be the crown jewel of that momentum, a massive nationally televised celebration of where the sport had arrived. Executives were confident, sponsors were excited, fans were counting down the days. Nobody saw what was coming, or at least nobody with any real power chose to stop it. Here's what the promotional materials and press releases never told you. Behind the polished exterior of the WNBA's record-breaking season, something ugly had been festering for a long time. Established veterans, players who had dedicated years, sometimes over a decade, to building their careers in the league, were struggling with something deeply human: jealousy. Not the kind you talk about openly, because no professional athlete wants to admit it, but the kind that quietly poisons locker rooms and private conversations, and eventually, if left unchecked, starts influencing actual decisions.
We'll place the call to Caitlin Clark to get whatever it is you need. Take a look at this. Shout out to Correlation. Correlation said, bruh, Caitlin is in Iowa and Studbud was just asking where she is. Caitlin Clark pulled a no-show. Caitlin Clark's out in Iowa, having a good old time, not dealing with this nonsense, going to see, hair people and all of this stuff. She ain't got time to be dealing with these people no more. And I don't blame her. If I was Caitlin Clark, I wouldn't want to deal with these idiots.
The core of the tension was straightforward. These were players who had sacrificed enormously for their sport during years when nobody was paying attention. They had played in front of half-empty arenas. They had dealt with the financial realities of being professionals in a league that, whatever its merits, did not compensate its athletes anywhere close to what their male counterparts earned. They had fought for years for the game to get the recognition they believed it deserved. And then Caitlin Clark arrived, and suddenly everything they had worked toward happened. But it happened because of her. Specifically, not because of the league's overall talent level, not because of years of groundwork, not because of any collective effort, because one player had captured the imagination of a mainstream audience in a way nobody else had managed to do. That's a hard thing to sit with, especially when the cameras follow her every movement and you're standing 3 feet away, becoming invisible. Reports from people close to the situation paint a picture of veteran players who felt genuinely sidelined despite still being in their primes. Press conferences where questions were exclusively about Clark, sponsorship conversations that started and ended with whether she'd be involved, television segments that treated the rest of the roster as background characters in her story. The resentment grew slowly, then quickly, and by the time the All-Star Weekend approached, it had curdled into something that was actively influencing how some players and old guard management figures were thinking about the event. The thinking, from what insiders have described, went something like this. This is supposed to be a celebration of the entire league, not a Caitlin Clark showcase. Other players deserve their moment too. And if the organization won't do something to create space for that, then maybe the people running the league need to step in and do it themselves. It sounds almost reasonable when you frame it that way, but the execution of that logic led somewhere that was neither reasonable nor defensible. 2 days before the All-Star Weekend was set to begin, something happened that the WNBA's communications team would have very much preferred never became public knowledge. Association coordinators quietly arranged a private meeting with Indiana's management, not publicly announced, not part of any standard pre-event briefing, a closed-door session with a very specific agenda that had reportedly been weeks in the making. The plan they finalized in that room was this. Caitlin Clark's playing time during the All-Star exhibition would be artificially capped. She would be limited to brief appearances in the first and third periods, essentially keeping her off the court for the majority of the showcase. The restriction was carefully documented in a way that framed it as a precautionary health protocol, a measure to protect her physical well-being ahead of the regular season's second half. That framing was not accidental. It gave the decision a layer of plausible deniability. If questioned publicly, the organization could point to player health and safety as the motivation. It sounded responsible. It sounded like they were looking out for their star. But people who were in or near that meeting have described a very different reality. The health protocol explanation was cover. The actual motivation was exactly what you'd suspect given everything that had been building for months. Influential voices wanted Clark's presence on the court minimized so that other players could occupy more of the spotlight during the most watched broadcast of the women's basketball calendar. They wanted to use her name and her drawing power to fill the building and generate the television audience that he brought with her, then effectively bench her once the cameras were rolling, so the veterans could have their moment. Think about the calculation embedded in that plan for a second. They were counting on her fan base to purchase the tickets. They were counting on her name to drive the television ratings that would satisfy the sponsors. They needed everything she represented commercially to make the event viable. And then, once all of that value had been extracted, the plan was to leave her sitting on the bench while other players performed for the audience her presence had assembled. It was, by any honest assessment, a spectacular act of institutional bad faith. When Clark was summoned to a private meeting and the restrictions were laid out in front of her, the expectation in that room was compliance. The executives and coordinators who had engineered this scheme had apparently convinced themselves that she would absorb the insult quietly. Perhaps she'd express some displeasure privately. Perhaps her representatives would push back in the background. But ultimately, they believed, she would show up, accept the limited role, and play the part they'd scripted for her. That assumption turned out to be one of the most expensive miscalculations in recent sports history. What happened next is now being discussed as one of the most audacious individual stands any athlete has taken against an organizational power structure in recent memory. Caitlin Clark did not quietly accept the playing time restrictions. She did not smile through the meeting and then complain about it later in interviews. She did not consult with agents and representatives for days before making a measured strategic response. She stood up and walked out. According to well-placed sources close to the situation, Clark severed communication with the organization almost immediately after the meeting concluded. She refused to board the private jet that had been arranged to transport players to Chicago. She did not appear at the mandatory press events scheduled for the day before the game. She skipped the red carpet gala entirely, and she formally removed her name from the All-Star exhibition roster. In her place, she was reportedly spotted back in Iowa, by all accounts unbothered, going about her life with a composure that only made the chaos erupting inside the WNBA's executive offices look more ridiculous by comparison. The choice she had presented to the organization was not subtle, and it was not negotiable. Either the playing time restrictions get publicly scrapped and she is allowed to play freely, or the league hosts its billion-dollar showcase weekend without its biggest draw. Initially, the organizational response was to wait her out. The assumption was that this was a negotiating tactic, a dramatic gesture designed to force better terms before she ultimately backed down. Surely, the thinking went, she would not actually allow the scrutiny and pressure of a national media story to continue building without eventually relenting. Surely she understood that walking away from the All-Star Weekend entirely would create an enormous controversy that she would then have to manage. What they failed to understand was that she had already done the math, and in her calculation, showing up under those conditions was worse than not showing up at all. As tip-off approached and Clark remained demonstrably, photographically, verifiably absent from the city of Chicago, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that this was a bluff. The most important player in women's basketball had called the organization's hand, and she had an unbeatable set of cards. The moment news broke publicly that Clark would not be participating in the All-Star exhibition, the economic consequences were immediate and they were devastating. Fans who had spent significant money specifically to see her play flooded ticket vendor platforms demanding refunds. These weren't casual attendees who had picked up cheap seats on a whim. Many of them had paid premium prices, planned travel, booked hotels, and arranged their schedules around a specific experience that was no longer being offered. The fury was real, and it was justified, and it translated directly into financial liability for the organization. The resale market, which had been operating at extraordinary premiums just days earlier, collapsed. Tickets that had been changing hands for several $1,000s became essentially worthless in the span of a few hours. The market had been pricing in the Caitlin Clark experience, and without that experience, there was no justification for the premium. Sellers couldn't give tickets away. The secondary market implosion was a public, real-time demonstration of exactly how much of the event's perceived value had been tied to one person.
Television executives who had structured their advertising sales around projected viewership numbers were reportedly in crisis mode. Those projections had been built on the assumption that Clark's presence would drive the kind of crossover audience that women's basketball had never previously been able to reliably deliver. Without her, those numbers were not going to materialize. Advertisers who had paid for exposure to that specific audience had legitimate grounds to demand that the terms of their agreements be renegotiated. Some were reportedly threatening breach of contract action. The financial exposure was enormous. Major international brands that had specifically allocated advertising budgets around the All-Star Weekend, budgets that were tied directly to Clark's drawing power, began making it very clear that their continued financial relationship with the league was contingent on her participation. These were not small accounts. These were the kinds of corporate partnerships that represent significant revenue for any sports organization, and they were evaporating in real time. The scale of the financial damage is difficult to overstate. What had been projected as a massive revenue-generating weekend for the WNBA was transforming into a financial catastrophe, and it was happening faster than anyone in the executive offices had the capacity to manage. Commissioner Adam Silver, by multiple accounts, was not pleased. This was not a controlled controversy. This was not a situation that the league's communications team could spin into something manageable with a well-worded statement. This was a visible, quantifiable, publicly unfolding disaster. Here's where the story takes a turn that feels almost too fitting to be real. The veteran players who had pushed for this playing time restriction, who had wanted the All-Star spotlight freed from Clark's shadow, got precisely what they had engineered: an exhibition game without her, a stage with no towering presence to compete with, their moment. And it was a disaster for them specifically. The cameras that had been so relentlessly focused on Clark's every move during WNBA events throughout the season were notably less interested without her. The press contingent that had made All-Star Weekend feel like a massive event was noticeably reduced. The social media engagement that typically turned every Clark game into a viral moment was nowhere to be found. The remaining attendees, some of whom had stayed despite the news, others who had come not specifically for Clark but for the event itself, radiated a level of frustration and disappointment that no amount of in-arena entertainment could overcome. The veterans discovered something in that arena that should have been obvious from the outside, but apparently wasn't obvious enough to override months of accumulated resentment. Their relevance in the current commercial landscape of women's basketball was to a painful degree connected to her presence. The coverage they received when she was on the court alongside them was exponentially greater than the coverage they received without her. The audience that was watching the games that featured her were watching them too. Remove her, and the spotlight they had resented her for occupying didn't redistribute itself to them. It simply went somewhere else entirely. They had mistaken proximity to a phenomenon for participation in it, and the moment the phenomenon was removed, the distinction became brutally clear. It is genuinely difficult to think of a more comprehensive own goal in recent sports organizational history. They conspired to reduce her visibility, and in doing so, they made their own irrelevance impossible to ignore. The veterans' victory over Caitlin Clark turned out to be a victory over their own careers and their own legacies.
With the financial damage mounting by the hour and the public relations situation deteriorating rapidly, WNBA leadership shifted from waiting Clark out to something closer to full institutional panic. Reports from inside the organization described executive chaos, phone calls being made at all hours, emergency meetings, a frantic scramble to find some combination of concessions and reassurances that would convince Clark to reverse her decision and salvage whatever could be salvaged from the weekend. The playing time restrictions were reportedly offered to be scrapped entirely and publicly. The organization, which days earlier had been smugly confident that a young player would simply accept whatever terms they handed her, was now in the position of begging her to return on whatever terms she was willing to accept. It was too late. The damage to the event itself was already done. The ticket market had collapsed. The television audience projections were already being revised downward. Sponsors were already in conversations about what the league's breach of their expectations meant for the financial agreements. There was no version of events where Clark returning to Chicago at that point fully reversed the catastrophic momentum that had already built. But more fundamentally, the attempt to walk back the restrictions exposed something the organization probably would have preferred remain internal. By publicly abandoning the playing time caps under pressure, they implicitly confirmed that the caps had never been about health protocols in the first place. If this had genuinely been a standard protective measure for an athlete's physical well-being, you don't abandon it because that athlete refuses to accept it and the financial consequences become uncomfortable. You stand behind the decision because you believe it's right. The speed with which the organization pivoted from defending the restrictions to offering to eliminate them told the entire story of what those restrictions had actually been about. The league found itself in an impossible position. If they maintained the caps, they were admitting publicly that they were willing to sacrifice hundreds of millions in revenue to spite their biggest star. If they abandoned them, they were admitting the caps had been punitive and politically motivated from the beginning. There was no third option. There was no version of this that reflected well on the people who had made the decision. Strip away all of the drama and the financial figures and the organizational chaos, and what this episode really represents is a clarity of power that the WNBA's leadership apparently needed to have demonstrated to them in the most expensive possible way. Caitlin Clark is not simply a talented basketball player who the league employs. She is the primary commercial engine of the entire enterprise at this particular moment in time. She is the reason casual audiences are tuning in. She is the reason brands are spending money. She is the reason tickets are selling at premiums. She is the reason the WNBA is occupying the kind of mainstream cultural space it has never historically occupied. That reality should have been obvious before any of this happened. The data was not ambiguous. The ticket sales were documented. The television ratings were documented. The social media engagement was documented. The sponsor interest was documented. Every commercially relevant metric told the same story with the same clarity. And yet, someone in a position of power looked at all of that evidence and concluded that the correct move was to limit her playing time in the most watched event of the women's basketball calendar, because some veteran players were unhappy with how much attention she received. That was the trade-off that was made. Organizational financial stability in exchange for appeasing internal jealousy. What Clark demonstrated by walking away is something that will reshape the power dynamics of her relationship with this league for the foreseeable future. She demonstrated that her leverage is not theoretical. It is not something she mentions in contract negotiations as an abstract concept. It is real, it is deployable, and she is willing to use it when the situation warrants it.
She also demonstrated something about her own character that her supporters have been arguing for a long time, and her critics have consistently underestimated. She is not someone who can be managed through institutional pressure or manipulated through public scrutiny. She assessed the situation, made a decision based on her own principles, and executed it without flinching. While executives were counting on media attention to force her hand, she was in Iowa, apparently unconcerned. That is not a person who is going to quietly absorb future disrespect to avoid controversy. That is a person who has just established, in the most public and economically consequential way possible, exactly what it costs to disrespect her. The 2026 WNBA All-Star Weekend in Chicago will be studied in sports business programs for years, not as a cautionary tale about one player's ego or one league's mismanagement, though it is certainly both of those things, but as a case study in what happens when organizational decision-making becomes disconnected from commercial reality and starts being driven by internal politics that have nothing to do with the actual product being sold. The league has a significant rebuilding task ahead of it. Sponsor relationships need to be repaired. Television partnerships need to be renegotiated or reassured. The public trust of millions of fans who paid significant money for an experience that was taken from them needs to somehow be addressed. And all of that has to happen while Clark herself has now been publicly positioned as the wronged party in a conflict that the organization started. The veteran players who were at the center of this controversy face their own reckoning. Their decision to leverage their relationships with league management to engineer a playing time restriction has been publicly exposed, and the consequences of that decision have been publicly documented. The narrative around their careers is now permanently attached to this episode. And Caitlin Clark goes forward with something that no amount of organizational maneuvering can take from her. She has proven her value in the most concrete terms imaginable. Not through statistics, not through award ceremonies, not through endorsement announcements, through the documented financial collapse that occurred the moment she decided she was done participating. The establishment tried to put a ceiling on her impact and discovered she was already holding up the roof. Every executive, every veteran player, every corporate partner, and every casual observer now understands the relationship between Caitlin Clark and the WNBA with a clarity that no promotional campaign could have manufactured. She needed them far less than they needed her, and now everyone knows it. The real question this situation raises isn't just about basketball. It's about what happens in any industry when the people running an institution prioritize internal politics over the product that makes the institution valuable. The WNBA had something extraordinary, a genuine crossover star capable of reshaping public perception of an entire sport. And a faction within that institution decided that managing internal jealousy was more important than protecting and maximizing that asset. The result is documented, the cost is documented, and somewhere in Iowa, the person who proved all of it is deciding what comes next entirely on her own terms. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think she was right to walk away entirely, or should she have shown up and dominated despite the disrespect? Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications because this story is nowhere near finished yet.